Hello, everyone, and welcome back. So this is the second part of our Module 4 lecture in multivariate statistics. In our first part of this lecture, we talked about ANOVA models, analysis of covariance, and what the times in which those would be useful, and a little bit about how they work. So now we're going to dig into another really useful tool, which is the repeated measures ANOVA. Repeated measures ANOVA is up next. All right, so a little background on repeated measures ANOVA. Typically, you would use a repeated measures ANOVA when you have more than two measurements for the same participant. More than two being the key word here. If you only have two measures for a participant, then an ANCOVA is probably your best bet to look for change over time, assuming you have some sort of categorical variable that you're also looking at, like a treatment or a grouping or something like that. A repeated measures ANOVA can be used to track growth or change in any measure over time. You don't have to have that kind of treatment control distinction, so that's nice. And but you can add in the treatment distinction as well. So you can look at different interventions over time and growth and change over time as well. So that is definitely a strength of this method. One cool part about repeated measures ANOVA is that you're able to leverage the power of having more than one measurement per person very well. And so a smaller sample in terms of people can actually result in a lot of power because you're kind of taking advantage of the fact that each person is contributing three, four, five different measurements over time. So that's really good. Tricky part. In order to do that, you have to meet some pretty tricky assumptions. And so, in some ways, these models are less preferred to something like a multi-level model, which is another topic that I teach a whole course about. But it can be very good for examining measurement over time, for sure. So let's look at some examples then of how a one-way repeated measures ANOVA might work. So the diagram up here, I apologize if this looks a little bit small, is one example of how you might implement a repeated measures ANOVA. So let's assume that you are interested in um, growth in learning, growth in attitudes, beliefs, motivation, et cetera, over the course of a school year. You might implement some kind of a system where you measure students' outcome, whatever that is, repeatedly. Maybe let's say you measure at the beginning of the school year, then at the end of 4 or 5 weeks, and then a little bit later, and then a third measurement, and then a fourth measurement, and then again at the end of the school year. So in this type of a design, there really is no comparison group. So it's not an experimental control thing. You're just interested in looking at how a particular construct that you're interested in is changing over time. And repeated measures ANOVA can be a nice way to get a sense of that. Is the level of motivation, attitudes at the beginning of the school year the same as at the end? Did it change at all going from one time point to the last time point? If you only have two time points, right, you could use a paired samples t-test, right? So if you only have beginning and end, then you could use a paired samples t-test just to see if they're different. What a repeated measures ANOVA gets you is it looks at the time points in between as well. So it looks for change across all of those time points simultaneously, which is pretty cool. You might also, though, have a question about the implementation of an intervention. And so here, let's say you start with some sort of an intervention and then you measure how the student's doing, and then you intervene again and you measure again, you intervene again, you measure again. This is not unlike, something like a multiple baseline design or a single case design, albeit with maybe a larger sample. And again, a repeated measures ANOVA can help you accomplish this. You can not only look at change within the individual, you can also look at variability according to what group they're in. So it's pretty flexible. It has a lot of different options. So a little bit about the theory of repeated measures ANOVA. Um, what's interesting is that in some ways, a repeated measures ANOVA flips our understanding of what is important and uses different variability to sort of get an estimate, which is kind of cool. So let's think for a second about classic between subjects ANOVA, which we learned about back in module 2. So you have 3 groups and you want to know if there are differences between those groups. That's a classic one-way ANOVA. In that design, we're interested in the between subjects variation. And we assume that we're interested in the between groups variation. And we assume that the within variation, the within groups variation is actually error, random noise. So there's some variability within the group, but that's considered error. What we're really interested in is the variability between groups. So that's kind of the classic approach. In repeated measures ANOVA, that flips. And so variation between participants in some ways is less important than variation within, because what we want to know is, are there systematic changes within each person over time? We know that people are going to be different, right? So there will be some between participant variation, but we're really interested in the within variation. And so that's represented here in this diagram. You have total variability here, and this is in terms of sums of squares, which is just the squared variability in scores across the whole sample. So SSB is the between participant variation. So that's basically noise here. SSW is the within participant variation. That's what we're interested in. And then some portion of that is going to be random noise, but then some of that could be the effect of some kind of intervention. So we're trying to separate out the systematic within person variation from the random within person variation. So just a little bit conceptually showing you what's going on. Basically, we're kind of taking the between subjects ANOVA paradigm and we're flipping it inside out a little bit, which is kind of cool. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges. So, as you probably found in the chapter for this week too, the reading, if you haven't done it yet, I believe it's Lix and Kieselman maybe on repeated measures ANOVA. Um, there are some challenges in terms of the underlying assumptions that you have to address anytime you try to explain variability within person with repeated measures. So just for starters, if all you have is repeated measures, so the same person measured here, 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 so on and so forth, the same participants are measured in all conditions. So of course, my score at time 1 is going to be correlated to my score at time 2, time 3, and time 4. So our scores within each person, the scores correlate. And that, of course, violates the assumption of independence. And so we need to rely on another assumption that, maybe these things they are related, but they're related in a very specific way. And that's the assumption of what's called sphericity. So in a simple way, what sphericity is that the variance in outcomes across time and the covariances between all those things are basically fixed, that they don't vary from time point to time point. We'll look at this graphically in just a minute. But that's a challenging assumption to meet. And if you don't meet it, you almost never do, by the way. This is another thing with repeated measures ANOVAs. You basically pay a penalty for that by adjusting the degrees of freedom. And so it makes it harder to find statistical significance. You essentially adjust those degrees of freedom down. You also have to make this assumption of multivariate normality, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. So you've got a couple things. You've got MVN, multivariate normality, and you've got sphericity that are both assumptions that really need to be met in order to get good, reliable estimates from those repeated measures ANOVAs. So here is a visual to demonstrate for you what the assumption of sphericity means. Basically, in an ideal world, if we're going to meet this assumption, the variability across time in these measures should be constant. So what we're looking at here is actually a covariance matrix. So each one here shows a variance. So the variability at time 1 should be equal to the variability at time 2. That's this middle box, should be equal to the variability at time 3. That's the assumption that the sphericity assumption is making. In addition to that, the covariances between all those time points should be consistent too. So the covariance between time one and time two should be fixed, time one and time three should be fixed, and they all should be fixed to the same value. So not only are they consistent with each other, so the variance is the same, the covariance should be the same too. And this is a strong assumption, especially when you imagine, time one might be a year apart from time two, which might be a year apart from time three. A lot of things can happen in a year, right? And it's hard to make the assumption that those different intervals of outcome are going to result in this kind of predictable pattern. So that is a tough assignment, an assumption. But typically, again, this assumption is almost assumed to be violated, right? Which is maddening. I know you're like, oh my gosh, why have an assumption that's always violated? But that's really typically what happens. And the solution is you just kind of pay a penalty. You adjust your degrees of freedom, which makes it harder to find significance when you have possible violations of that. And there are a couple common adjustments. The three that are implemented in Stata, for example, are the Hohenfeld greenhouse geyser and boxes adjustment. Basically, you look at all of them and hope that the p-value is significant in all. The most conservative adjustment is what's called boxes, and if that one is significant, you should be still in good shape. So there's a lot of kind of wiggling that goes on under the hood with repeated measures ANOVA to try to account for those possible violations of assumptions. So then we have this assumption of multivariate normality. So, we should by now be familiar with this idea of univariate normality. We can make a histogram and we can kind of look for that kind of bell-shaped curve. And we can run some statistical tests like a skew test or kurtosis to try to figure out if this thing actually resembles a normal distribution. Well, since a repeated measures ANOVA has multiple outcomes, you actually need an even stronger assumption than just univariate normality. You need multivariate normality, which is basically normality not only at one time point, but all across time points. And it's an extension of univariate normality just across many measures. Um, One way to think about this is across all time points collectively, are the measures normally distributed so this might be like a three-dimensional normal plot. So this is almost like a mountain now, right? It actually has like depth and stuff, as opposed to just a curve. That's kind of what we're looking for when we're assessing the assumption of multivariate normality. Again, proving this is very hard to do. The best approach, what I recommend anytime you're looking at this, is you do individual tests of normality, then you check pairs of variables, and then you check them all. And I know that seems like a lot. Stata has a routine for this, and R has a package that does this. So basically, you run the routine or the package, and you look at the results. If the measures look really non-normal, you might need another approach, maybe like a multi-level modeling, or you might need to do some transformations on your variables. There are other more robust methods that you can use, but ideally, this is an assumption that should be met. I have a sample article by Burdensky on, let's just say, Canvas as opposed to Blackboard, that has more information on assessing multivariate normality. If you're interested, you can also just shoot me an email. But it's another assumption that you see quite a bit. All right, so I think this is a good time to try looking at some repeated measures ANOVAs. And that, of course, will be in our demonstration video for the week. So we have some interesting data. So this is sleep data. This is data, again, from Michael Mitchell's excellent book. It's 100 participants who participated in a trial of new sleep medication. And so one day each month, they recorded how long they slept. And the participants started taking medication after month one. So there was like a baseline period, and then they started taking it, and then they continued for 2 more months. So we have in total 3 measurements from 100 people for it, 3 times 100, so 300 total measurements. So this, this would could also be applied in a classroom setting or a therapy setting. Just participants who, you have a baseline period and then you measure, and then you have another couple months of observation and measurement to see if there's change. Just like in part one, I included a sample APA write-up for these repeated measures ANOVA models. They get a little trickier because you have to talk about the how to correct for the violations of assumptions, which are down here. But the write-up is again pretty similar to a lot of sort of ANOVA style write-ups. And then of course you can do post hoc contrasts in ANOVAs. You can kind of compare groups and see if the differences were significant. So that all connects to the example on sleep that I go over in the demonstration video. And this is that Mitchell book I mentioned. I think even for our users, the conceptual stuff is pretty good in here, and the data sets are good if you want some data to kind of play with these different models and see how it all works. So that is repeated measures ANOVA. I hope you found that helpful. And next up is the demonstration videos. Thanks.